On a cold October night in 1778, a Long Island farmer named Abraham Woodhull crept across a field in the dark, knelt beside a wooden box buried at the edge of a hay meadow, and pressed a folded letter into it. The letter was invisible, written in a chemical ink that appeared as nothing on blank paper. It would only reveal its contents when a specific reagent was brushed across the surface, a formula known to exactly 3 people in the Continental Army. What that letter contained was a full accounting of British troop positions, naval deployments, and planned movements inside New York City, the most heavily fortified military headquarters in North America. The box sat in a field Woodhull rented to his courier, Austin Rowe. Rowe would pick it up on his next supply run, a routine trip to Manhattan that any Long Island tavern keeper might make, raising no suspicion whatsoever from the British sentries who searched his wagon at the checkpoints. From there, the letter would pass through 4 more hands, cross Long Island Sound by whaleboat in the dark, travel by express rider through Connecticut, and arrive at George Washington's headquarters, written in invisible ink, inside what appeared to be an entirely innocent letter addressed to a known Tory sympathizer. No name appeared anywhere in the chain. No identity was written down at any point that a captured letter could reveal. The network had been running for less than 3 weeks, and it had already produced intelligence that Washington called more valuable than anything he had received in months. The British had 30,000 soldiers in New York and a spy-hunting apparatus that had hanged at least 1 American agent and was actively searching for more. The network running intelligence out from under their noses was built from farmers, tavern keepers, a whaleboat captain, a merchant who wrote Tory newspaper columns, and not a single one of them would ever be caught. This is the story of the Culper Ring, the most effective spy network in the American Revolutionary War, built not from soldiers but from neighbors. And the way it worked, piece by piece, layer by layer, is more interesting than most people know. If you want this kind of history, the kind that actually explains how wars are decided in the shadows, subscribe before we go further. This one goes deep. Before you can understand why the Culper Ring was designed the way it was, you need to understand what had gone wrong before it existed. In September 1776, 2 years before Woodhull pressed his first invisible letter into that wooden box, a 21-year-old schoolteacher and Continental Army captain named Nathan Hale volunteered to spy on the British inside New York. Washington needed intelligence desperately. The city had just fallen to British forces after the disastrous Battle of Long Island. The Continental Army was in full retreat, demoralized and outgunned. Hale was the only officer who volunteered when Washington asked for someone to go behind enemy lines. He had no cover, no code name, no training in the practical arts of deception. He carried his Yale diploma with his real name on it. He traveled under his actual identity, disguised as a Dutch schoolteacher looking for work, a thin pretense that apparently convinced no one who mattered. He was recognized, by some accounts, in a Manhattan tavern by a British officer named Robert Rogers who suspected him and drew him into conversation. By other accounts, Hale's own loyalist cousin turned him in. However it happened, Hale was captured on September 21, 1776, while attempting to cross back to American lines. He was interrogated by General William Howe the following morning and hanged that same afternoon. He was 21 years old. He had gathered essentially nothing of military value before his capture. The British denied him a Bible, denied him a clergyman, and burned the letters he asked to write to his family. What he said at the gallows has been debated by historians ever since. The version that entered American mythology, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," comes primarily from a second-hand account by a British officer who later reported the conversation to American captains under a flag of truce. Whether Hale said those exact words or a variant of them, the earliest British accounts describe him as dying with composure and dignity. Benjamin Tallmadge had been Hale's classmate at Yale. They had debated politics, studied Latin, read the same plays, walked the same grounds. It was Tallmadge who had written to Hale in the summer of 1775, urging him to join the Continental Army, telling him that the country was holding out her arms and demanding assistance. 2 years later, Tallmadge received the news of his friend's execution in silence. When Washington appointed Tallmadge Director of Military Intelligence in late 1778 and asked him to build a spy network inside New York, the memory of what had happened to Nathan Hale was not merely personal grief. It was the operational brief. Every design decision Tallmadge made for the next 5 years, every layer of protection, every anonymized identity, every dead drop and code number and invisible letter, was a direct answer to the specific, identifiable failures that had sent his friend to the gallows. He was going to build something that could not be destroyed by a single mistake, and he was going to build it from people he had known since childhood. Tallmadge was 24 years old when Washington handed him the assignment. He was a cavalry major, not an intelligence professional. There were no intelligence professionals in the Continental Army in 1778 because there was no professional intelligence service. He was building from nothing, and everything he built he essentially invented as he went. The first principle he established was one that sounds obvious, but was genuinely radical by the standards of 18th century military practice: permanence. Every previous American intelligence effort, including Nathan Hale's fatal mission, had been a single-use operation. One man, sent in once, to bring back whatever he could observe before trying to get out. Tallmadge's network would be permanent. His agents would live in place, maintain their normal civilian lives, and feed information continuously over months and years. They would not be soldiers occasionally playing civilian. They would be civilians who happened, quietly, to be passing information. The second principle was compartmentalization so strict that it would make a modern intelligence professional nod in recognition. Washington himself was never told the real names of the agents in the ring. Tallmadge was the only person who knew the full network. Each member knew only what they needed to know about the people directly above and below them in the chain. If anyone was captured and broke under interrogation, the damage would be catastrophic only to themselves and possibly their immediate contact. The rest of the ring would survive. Every member received a code number. Washington was 711, England was 745, New York was 727, Long Island was 728, Tallmadge was 721, operating under the name John Bolton. Abraham Woodhull, the ring's first field agent, became Samuel Culper, hence the ring's name, and was coded 722. The code itself was built from John Entick's New Spelling Dictionary, a common reference book that any educated person might own. Words and names were encoded as 3-digit numbers corresponding to their position in the dictionary. A letter that looked like a merchant's routine correspondence was, when decoded, a precise military intelligence report. And then there was the invisible ink. The formula had been developed by Sir James J., brother of the future Chief Justice John Jay, a chemical compound called sympathetic stain that left no visible mark on paper and could only be revealed by brushing a specific reagent across the surface. A Culper letter might be written between the lines of an entirely innocent-looking letter addressed to a known Tory sympathizer on Long Island, so that even if it was seized at a British checkpoint, the inspecting officer would see nothing but a harmless social note. The delivery route was equally methodical. Robert Townsend, the ring's primary source inside New York City, passed intelligence to Austin Rowe, a Setauket tavern keeper who made regular supply runs to Manhattan that any British sentry would find entirely unremarkable. Rowe would deposit the letters in the wooden box buried in the field Abraham Woodhull rented to him, a dead drop so ordinary that it was invisible. Woodhull would retrieve them, add his own observations and analysis, and pass the package to Caleb Brewster, a whaleboat captain who carried contraband across Long Island Sound and was the only member of the ring whose identity the British had actually managed to confirm, a fact that was managed by simply keeping Brewster's role as courier rather than source, so that his capture would cut one link but not the chain. From Brewster, the material went to Tallmadge in Connecticut, who decoded, assessed, and forwarded it to Washington. The round trip from New York City to Washington's headquarters, by dead drop, by foot, by whaleboat, by express rider, took roughly 6 days. It was not fast. In a war where events could move in hours, a 6-day intelligence loop had real limitations. Washington complained about it constantly, pressing Tallmadge repeatedly for faster delivery. But it was secure in a way that nothing else the Americans attempted ever managed to be. From October 1778 to the British evacuation of New York in 1783, not one member of the Culper Ring was ever identified and arrested by the British. The heart of the Culper Ring, the reason it worked at all, was Robert Townsend. Townsend was 26 years old when he joined the network in the summer of 1779, recruited by Woodhull to take over as the Ring's primary source inside New York City. He was a merchant and part-time writer from Oyster Bay, Long Island, the son of a prominent Quaker family, mild-mannered and quiet in a way that people consistently underestimated. He had a small dry goods shop in Manhattan and wrote a society column for James Rivington's Royal Gazette, the most influential Loyalist newspaper in occupied New York, a publication that British officers read and advertised in and trusted as a reflection of respectable opinion. This gave Townsend access that no soldier or obvious patriot could have approximated. He attended the social gatherings of British officers who wanted favorable publicity. He sat in the coffee houses where officers relaxed and talked freely among what they took to be fellow Loyalists. He was, by every visible indicator, a man of moderate Tory sympathies, cautious, commercially minded, the kind of colonial who had concluded that practical accommodation with British authority was preferable to the disruptions of rebellion. He coded his intelligence reports as Samuel Culper, Jr. He wrote them in invisible ink. He handed them to Rowe tucked inside the goods Rowe purchased from his shop, and then slipped out the back to read what Tallmadge had asked for and compose his reply. What Townsend provided was not just raw observation. He had the analytical instinct to understand which pieces of information mattered and which were noise. He noted the arrival and departure of warships. He counted the regiments moving through the city. He recorded the morale of British officers at social events. The difference between confident chatter and anxious silence at a dinner table is itself intelligence if you know how to read it. He reported on supply levels, on fortification construction, on command changes and rumored operations. James Rivington, his newspaper partner and coffeehouse associate, is believed by some historians to have eventually become an active member of the Ring himself, a claim that was not even suspected until 1860, long after the war ended. If true, Rivington was passing intelligence from inside the most prominent Loyalist media operation in British-occupied America, an act of audacity so complete that it is almost difficult to categorize. The evidence remains debated, but the possibility is consistent with everything else about how the Culper Ring operated. Quietly, through people nobody thought to suspect, in plain sight. Townsend never revealed his involvement in the Ring in his lifetime. His identity as Culper Jr. was not definitively established until 1929, when a Long Island historian named Morton Pennypacker noticed that the handwriting in letters found in the Townsend family home matched the handwriting in Washington's collection of Culper intelligence. Townsend had kept his secret for 53 years after the war ended, taking it with him when he died in 1838. The Culper Ring's value to Washington was ongoing and cumulative, a steady, reliable stream of intelligence that shaped his decisions across 5 years of war. But 3 specific operations stand out as moments when the Ring did not simply inform the war, but directly altered its outcome. The first was in late 1779, when the Ring discovered that the British had obtained large quantities of the specific paper used to print Continental dollars. The plan was to manufacture massive quantities of counterfeit currency and distribute it through Loyalist networks in Connecticut and the surrounding region, flooding the colonial economy with worthless money and accelerating the financial collapse that was already one of the Continental Army's most serious threats. The Ring's intelligence reached Washington in time. The Continental Congress was warned, and the affected bills were pulled from circulation before the counterfeiting scheme could produce its intended destruction. The colonial economy. Already fragile, survived a blow it might not have withstood. The second operation was in July 1780, and it was the closest the Ring ever came to deciding the entire war in a single dispatch. Rochambeau's French army, the 6,000-strong force whose eventual arrival at Yorktown would help surround Cornwallis and end the war, had just landed at Newport, Rhode Island after 3 months at sea. The troops were exhausted, sick from the voyage, and still organizing their supplies and positions. General Henry Clinton, commanding British forces in New York, saw the opportunity clearly: hit the French before they had recovered, destroy the alliance before it could function, and eliminate at one stroke the military force that Britain had most reason to fear. Townshend learned of the plan. The intelligence was passed through the chain, Roe to Woodhull to Brewster to Tallmadge, and arrived at Washington's headquarters on July 21st, 10 days after the French had landed. Washington moved immediately. He marched his Continental forces across the Hudson River toward Manhattan in a visible, threatening demonstration that forced Clinton to abandon the Rhode Island operation and turn his attention back to the defense of New York City. The exhausted French troops were left to recover unmolested. If Clinton's attack had succeeded, the French force that survived Saratoga's diplomatic consequences and crossed the Atlantic to join the American cause would have been destroyed or scattered before it ever became effective. The Franco-American alliance, already strained by repeated failures to produce a significant joint victory, might not have survived the political and military blow. There is no Yorktown without Newport. There may be no victory without Yorktown. The Culper Ring saved the French alliance in a wooden box in a field in Setauket, Long Island, in the summer of 1780. The third operation was the one that history has given the most dramatic telling, though the Culper Ring's precise role in it remains somewhat debated by scholars. In the autumn of 1780, intelligence filtered through the network indicating that a high-ranking American officer was in treasonous correspondence with British spymaster Major John André. The officer was eventually identified as Benedict Arnold, who had already been appointed to command the American garrison at West Point, the fortified position controlling the Hudson River that was arguably the single most strategically important point in the entire war. Arnold's plan was to hand West Point and its garrison to the British in exchange for a commission and £20,000. André was captured carrying the plans hidden in his boot. Arnold, warned in time, fled to British lines. The plot failed. Washington, arriving at West Point to find the garrison intact and Arnold gone, was reported to have said that he hoped he would never be obliged to be the instrument of such execution, and then ordered André hanged anyway because the laws of war left him no other choice. André went to the gallows with the composure of a man who had accepted what was coming. His whispered last words, reported by those present, were, "It will be but a momentary pang." West Point stayed American. The Hudson Corridor stayed intact, and the war continued toward the conclusion that Yorktown would eventually provide. The Culper Ring tends to get told as the story of a handful of named men: Tallmadge, Woodhull, Townshend, Brewster. The supporting cast gets compressed or dropped entirely, which misses the degree to which this network depended on people operating below the level of named history. Hercules Mulligan ran a clothing shop in Manhattan that catered to wealthy New Yorkers, including senior British officers. He had been an early patriot before the British occupation, a friend and former landlord of Alexander Hamilton, who had introduced him to the intelligence network. As a tailor, Mulligan spent time measuring and fitting British officers, conversations that naturally wandered into operational details, departure dates, troop movements, and anticipated campaigns. He passed what he overheard to his enslaved manservant, Cato, who served as his courier, a man moving through the streets of occupied New York on behalf of his enslaver, carrying intelligence that could have gotten both of them killed, and doing so without the legal standing to have chosen any of it freely. Cato's story sits at the intersection of the American Revolution's founding contradictions, and it almost never appears in the standard telling. Austin Roe rode more than 110 miles round-trip through British-patrolled countryside every time he made his supply run to Townshend's shop in Manhattan. He was stopped at checkpoints, questioned by British officers, and searched repeatedly over the course of years, always with invisible letters hidden in goods stacked in his wagon. he was never caught. He died in 1830, and his role in the ring was not publicly known for nearly a century after that. Anna Strong's contribution is the most debated piece of the entire ring's history. The traditional account that she used a clothesline signal system visible from Long Island Sound, hanging a black petticoat when Brewster was in the area and handkerchiefs indicating which cove he was using, has been questioned by historians who note that it relies largely on local tradition rather than documented record. What is documented is that the British suspected a Setauket woman matching Strong's profile of patriot activities, which suggests she was doing something that made them nervous, even if the precise nature of her contribution remains uncertain. And then there is the question of Agent 355, identified in the Culper Code simply as Lady, a single mention in a letter from Woodhull referring to a woman of his acquaintance who might help him outwit the British. Popular history has built an entire legendary figure from this one sentence, a mysterious woman embedded in British high society, potentially connected to André's circle, possibly the source that tipped the network to Arnold's treason. The honest answer is that there is not enough historical evidence to reconstruct who she was or what precisely she did, though several researchers have proposed candidates, including a woman named Elizabeth, who was enslaved by Townsend's family and may have passed information from inside a British officer's household. The single most important thing to understand about Agent 355 is that the legend almost certainly exceeds the documentation. But the documentation itself is suggestive enough that dismissing her entirely would also be wrong. The British were not stupid. Their counterintelligence operation was real, their interrogations were effective, and they had executed at least one American spy and imprisoned others. The fact that the Culper Ring operated for 5 years without a single member being arrested by British authorities is not simply a story of British incompetence. It is a story of how an intelligence network built on the right principles can function in plain sight of an adversary who doesn't know where to look. The core of Tallmadge's genius was this: he made his agents ordinary. They did not break their patterns. Townsend did not stop writing his Tory columns when he was passing intelligence. He kept writing them, kept attending the same dinners, kept maintaining the same social relationships. Rowe did not change his route or his schedule when carrying intelligence reports. He made the same supply run he always made at the same intervals for the same commercial reasons. The network functioned precisely because its components looked exactly like what they claimed to be. The British came close to cracking it twice. In June 1779, a letter from Washington to Tallmadge was intercepted that referred to someone whose name was abbreviated only as C. British cavalry, under the notoriously aggressive Colonel Banastre Tarleton, attacked Tallmadge's camp at Poundridge and captured his horse along with some papers, including the letter with the partial reference. The British now knew that a spy identified by a name beginning with C was operating in New York City and that Tallmadge was the intelligence director. What they did not know was who C was. The partial reference was enough to increase patrols and scrutiny, but not enough to identify Woodhull, let alone Townsend, who had not yet joined the ring at that point. The second close call came when Benedict Arnold defected to the British in September 1780. Arnold knew the broad outlines of the intelligence network. He knew Tallmadge, knew there were spies in New York, may have known about Hercules Mulligan specifically. When he defected, he gave the British what he knew. Mulligan was arrested and held for months before being released for lack of specific evidence. Townsend, alarmed by Mulligan's arrest, suspended his activities for a period out of fear that Arnold had more specific knowledge than he actually possessed. Both times, the ring survived because of the same thing. Tallmadge had never written down the complete picture in any document that could be seized. No single captured letter, no single interrogation could give the British the full chain. The network had been built to absorb the failure of individual components, and it did. 5 years, not one arrest, not one exposure of the chain from source to Washington. In the history of intelligence operations, it is a remarkable record, made more remarkable by the fact that the people who achieved it were, by profession, a farmer, a tavern keeper, a whaleboat captain, a merchant, and a tailor. When the war ended and the British evacuated New York in November 1783, the Culper Ring simply stopped. There was no formal disbanding, no official acknowledgement, no ceremony. The members returned to their civilian lives, Woodhull to his farm, Rowe to his tavern, Townsend to his merchant business, and kept their silence. Washington, who knew the Ring's work better than anyone, and who had directed its operations through Tallmadge with specific, detailed instructions across 5 years, made no public reference to it in his correspondence that named names or revealed identities. The men who had served him most closely in intelligence remained, at his discretion and their own, unknown. Townsend never discussed it publicly. When he died in 1838 at the age of 84, his identity as Culper Jr. died with him, undiscovered for another 91 years. Woodhull outlived the war by decades and wrote nothing for the record. Brewster became a ferryman on Long Island Sound, the same waters he had crossed by whaleboat with British patrols searching for him. Austin Rowe ran his tavern. None of them received the pensions, the honors, or the public recognition that veterans who had served openly received. The general public learned the Culper Ring had existed at all in the 1930s, roughly a century and a half after it had done its work. What the Ring was, finally, is a specific kind of answer to a specific kind of question. What do you do when you are outgunned, outnumbered, outresourced, and up against an enemy that controls the ground, the ports, and the city? Tallmadge's answer was that you work with what you have, which was neighbors, people who had grown up in the same towns, attended the same churches, trusted each other across years of shared ordinary life, and who could pass inside enemy territory precisely because they had never given anyone reason to doubt them. Britain had 30,000 soldiers in New York. The network that helped defeat them was built from the inside by a farmer who was often so frightened of discovery that he wrote to Tallmadge, begging him to destroy every letter the moment it was read, not knowing that Washington's staff was quietly keeping the originals for administrative reasons, which is the only reason we can read them today. The British Empire, with all its professional soldiers and capable officers and counterintelligence operation, spent 5 years failing to find the men and women watching them from inside their own drawing rooms. It was, in the end, exactly what Tallmadge had intended it to be: invisible. If this kind of history is what you come here for, the machinery behind the famous outcomes, the people who never made the statues but made the victory possible, subscribe and drop a comment. Tell me which member of the Culper Ring you think deserves a full video of their own. Townsend writing Tory columns while feeding intelligence to Washington is an argument all by itself. So is Cato, carrying dispatches through occupied New York with nothing protecting him but the world's most dangerous cover story.